What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I am on the mission to find the magic ingredient that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Cate Czerwinski, and we speak about experiences and how to turn workshops, any workshop, into memorable, unique, and non-replicable experiences. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. And now, lean back because you will be wowed. Hello, Cate.
Hi, Miriam.
I am super happy that we're recording this episode from my living room.
It's so cozy.
Right?
Yes.
Yes. Speaking about facilitation and experiences. And I always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
I do, with much joy. And I started referring to myself as a facilitator probably 2 years ago. I only became aware of facilitation as a career about 3 years ago and immediately fell in love with the concept, realizing that I had been doing it in my career for a long, long time in terms of leading project teams and product teams. I just didn't have a name for it. And so in late 2020, I took a course on leading hybrid meetings, and it was actually really a course about experience design and, yes, facilitation as a craft. And it opened up a whole world for me. And it took me probably another year after that to feel comfortable actually calling myself a facilitator. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and you earned the Facilitator of the Year of the NDB Never Done Before community last year.
Yes. So I have no choice. If other people are calling me the facilitator, then I must.
Yeah. And before digging deeper into the experience design part, how did you then apply the learnings from facilitation to your project product management career? Because that's why you learned how to facilitate in the first place or got interested in it.
So actually, I ended up taking the course because I had decided to take a break from software development work, generally speaking, and was looking for a new direction. And as with oftentimes happens with career transitions, I bounced in and out of that work. So my earliest opportunities were a couple months after finishing that course. I took a freelance product management short-term contract gig. And as is also often the case with me, I was being called in to fix something. Typically, there's a crisis. And so one of my taglines on my resume is like bringing order from chaos. And so this was no exception. And so I didn't necessarily even want to get back into product management. But of course, sometimes we take gigs because they are opportunities to earn money. And also this one I just made into an opportunity to facilitate. And so I just took every opportunity that I could to say, hey, you know what would be great right now is a 2-hour workshop.
Okay, so when you say facilitation, it was the workshop. And how was it received? I'm very curious because I hear more and more about project managers who want to facilitate, but it's like they come to the organizations and the organizations don't want facilitation.
Well, yeah, no, I don't think I ever called anything a workshop. To your point, it was more of a, okay, why don't we have, a session so that we can all collaborate and look at this problem from a few different angles together all at once, rather than over, chat. Or trading emails back and forth. So really pitching the outcomes versus the process. So, and I had a couple of successes and a couple of spectacular failures. It was, even over the course of 8 weeks. So
fast learning.
Yes, I made the most out of that. And then also, and I can talk about the biggest failure because it was a great learning experience, but the day-to-day also. So oftentimes, out of good intentions and people wanting, to have quote unquote flat hierarchies and involve everyone in the team, you end up in these enormous meetings that don't accomplish very much and end up being waste of people's times. And so one of the first things that I did was bring a little order and purpose to just our day-to-day ceremonies, right? And making sure that people understood their role in it and why they were there. And eventually, in the end, after observing and understanding the dynamics and eventually as the interim product manager, understanding the trajectory of the product and designing the MVP, I ended up actually doing some systemic changes and splitting the teams. So yeah, and that lived on after I departed. So it was through the facilitation of the meetings and seeing where, even when all the building blocks were in place for successful conversations and collaboration, when things were still falling apart, then I was able to diagnose these larger systemic issues and then make my recommendations, which most of which were kept, which actually makes me proud after I was gone. Yeah. So trying to make as much of a difference as I could within the span of an 8-week assignment.
Beautiful. And what I hear is that there were the good intentions of having flat hierarchies, but then having the good intentions, but coming in without the skills doesn't really help. And then even having the skills in the structure of having a conversation flat hierarchy is still not enough if there are too many people involved or if there are systemic issues in place.
Yeah, exactly. So if people on the teams, they were not clear on their purpose. And I mean, ultimately, and this happens all the time in my experience and from what I hear from other people in what want to be product-driven, customer-focused organizations versus, typical top-down structures, is that when there isn't a clear strategy, or maybe there is a clear strategy, but the communication the cadence isn't consistent, then people are confused. And so they end up working on, eventually delivery teams just end up working on whatever it is they're working on. And then spending a lot of time on things that aren't the most important, relevant things. And so then people get very demoralized and start acting out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all of these are facilitation skills, the purpose, the roles,
the communication of
communication.
them.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Just the listening also. So people get very frustrated and they act out because they feel as though they have no one that is really hearing them, and certainly nobody who is acting on what they're feeling and what they're going through. And if you do truly believe that everyone has something to offer, and in my case, I always do, and it goes beyond whatever their technical skill set is, then it really does eventually calm things down and improve the dynamics and the trust in the team, so that when you come up with a bold recommendation like, I think these teams should be split, and I think this is who the team should be, and this is why, people will follow. So yes, facilitation and leadership, there's,
two sides of the same medal.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you mentioned the learning from biggest failure, and I cannot resist to ask for an example.
So yes, bringing order from chaos. And also, I will own this. So this was only a few months after I had finished this course, and I was just trying to test a lot of things out. And I hadn't really fully grasped and understood where the teams were at and where the people within the teams were at. And I'm talking, when I say the team, I mean, I think there were 15 people that I was suddenly not a line manager for, but as the product manager, I was responsible for their collective performance and output. And so over 8 weeks, somehow I was supposed to assess the situation, build the relationships, and then start everybody moving in one direction. And selfishly, I just wanted to facilitate. And so I was like, this works. So it was obvious that there were breakdowns among designers. There were, even within our little team, there were definitely silos. The process was unclear for everyone. And so one of the developers actually suggested, hey, so we are having a hard time defining what our minimum viable product should be. Why don't we have a design sprint? And I was like, I don't even know really what that is, but yes, let's do that. And so
it involves the workshop.
Yes, exactly. Typical. And so from the very beginning, the design was flawed. I know now. And also the fact that I took it that if it came from the team, that the team was on board. And that was a huge mistake. So I put together just like a short really, it was more like an exercise of going through a process. And I didn't actually think that we would come up with a prototype that would work. But it was like, hey, let's see what it's like for the team to work together in this way. And so it was just a short, I think, half-day online thing where, everybody was there. I introduced it. Is everybody clear on what we're doing? And there was a lot of like, no. And I was like, oh, that's weird because you suggested it. And so I was like, this is trying to frame it for people. It's an experiment, take a step back from maybe dial down my rabid enthusiasm for this a little bit to meet people where they were. And through the course of it was like, okay, like, let's talk about what we think the most important things we're working on are. Like, what are some things we can let go? From the customer perspective, we had the customer-facing UI people, UX people there. And then it came time to put the people in breakouts, and there were 2 breakouts. And literally, I sat there watching, one breakout, I think we were on Teams. And so all I could do was observe what was happening on the Miro board. Mm-hmm. And there was one team that was like kind of doing stuff, and one team where there was just literally nothing happening. And I was sitting there with my colleague who was also a senior product person. And we were like, is this fine? Should we intervene? I don't know. And so we just left it. We were like, you know what? Let's just see. And so then this was about midway through. People were supposed to come up with their lo-fi prototypes. And so they came back out of the breakout rooms. And then one team had been cooperative. And we're like, yeah, we just like put together this little sketch. The other team completely rebelled.
Ooh.
And they were like, we don't, one person in particular, we just don't understand why we're here. And, there are just so many people here, and we feel like all this work has been done before, and we don't really understand what you want from us. And so it was very, and looking back, I should not have been surprised by who it came from. Mm-hmm. This person had always been rather challenging for me. And so I was like, okay. And I thought about it. And then I realized the bigger picture was this team. I wanted this team to co-create with me, right? I was coming from an environment in the past where it was very much, the team drove the features because mm-hmm. they understood best. Mm-hmm. And I wanted this team to be co-creative, and they just wanted me to tell them what to do. Mm. And so in that moment, which was for me just so disappointing, because that's, in general, that has never been the way that I've worked with my teams. I can make decisions. I make them all the time. But this was not one that I wanted to take on.
And I think there's a difference between taking a decision and telling people what to do. Mm. One is putting a vision out there and letting them finding their way how to do it. And the other one is telling them how to do it.
Yeah.
And babysitting them along the way.
Yes. And so we had a misalignment as to, I think, where that, for me, defining the feature set was one step beyond. Defining the feature set just based on the information that I had as somebody who had been there for 3 weeks. That seemed a bit too much mm-hmm. in this situation. And so, yes, so our expectations were off. Mutual expectations were off. And so no wonder they didn't understand why they were in resistant to being in this kind of collaborative environment. And so what I did in that moment, as soon as I just like realized what was going on a meta level, I just called the workshop off. I just said, hey, you know what? This is not working. What if I just simply defined the feature set for our minimum viable product? And they were like, that'd be great. And I said, okay, thanks for going with this experiment. This was a good learning experience for me. And, if you have any feedback other than this, let me know. But yeah, we can stop this now because I'm not here to waste anyone's time. And that's the other thing. And this is the other thing, because they felt like they didn't have a purpose and that they had been wasting their time. And mm-hmm. so this was just another instance of that, just in a different format. And so interestingly, this is the silver lining of the whole thing. Of that team, there were 2 women, one of whom had been the loudest voice in that meeting, the loudest challenger. And it was both of the women who wrote me afterward one called me afterward to tell me how brave I was to do that. And I also got a message from the loudest challenger saying, that she thought that was very brave, and she hoped that it didn't, she didn't come across as criticizing me personally, and et cetera, et cetera. So there I learned even more about the nature of the team that I was working with. Because if admitting something is obviously not going right was considered such a big, brave step, that told me a lot about some dynamics that I hadn't been seeing yet in the team.
Yeah. And still the opportunity there is because it is appreciated and acknowledged.
Yes.
So there is hope that this kind of culture of failing forward or psychological safety can be established.
Yeah, definitely.
Beautiful.
It really was. It really, really was. It was a lovely moment in some respects. And after that, I did what I had been resisting, and I just designed the feature set for this MVP, and they were so happy. And so, yeah, in a way, it also worked out because they spoke what they wanted clearly. And then I was able to respond to this. Right. And and then after that, we just had a much better mutual understanding about how we were going to go about our business. And I was able to create, based on this thing that I had proposed and they had accepted, then, I was able to design the way that we were going to meet, the cadence at which, we were going to collaborate among the mini teams. And then it just became a much more functioning operation.
Yeah. Thank you for that example.
Yeah.
I think it's very inspiring on many different levels, and I'm sure that in the audience, facilitators will take notes on finding I think there's so many learnings of arriving somewhere and then misunderstanding the ask. So they asked for a design sprint. Did they actually know what a design sprint was, or did they just want to experience maybe something new, something collaborative, and all they needed was maybe 2 hours team meeting or team experience?
Yeah.
And then, calling it out and how to grasp these team dynamics.
No. Then within the smaller functional teams that I had created, that I structured, I should say, then that gave them the opportunity in smaller settings to actually take ownership over what they were doing. Because there was in the larger system, there was definitely a lot of pushback against processes and a lot of complaining about how things were run and not a lot of delivery happening. So then by breaking up the system a little bit, the smaller units started functioning a bit better, and then the whole ended up functioning a bit better. So
basically to let those collaborate that are close to the result or close to the actual work, and not involving everyone who are maybe too far away from the work, and then why should they collaborate on a new process or a new part of the product?
There was a lot of people, and this happens all the time everywhere, a lot of people having opinions, and without strong boundaries about, okay, who is really owning what, it's very easy to evade decision making.
Beautiful. Thank you.
And there were definitely moments during that when I was like, maybe I shouldn't be a facilitator. But also, even through that, I was like, I definitely don't want to do product work anymore. So I was like, nope, this is still my path.
And where was then the turning point? So where was the moment where you then realized, oh yeah, I am a facilitator and I am maybe not in control, but maybe this is sort of being in flow.
So I actually ended up through an NDB connection. It was a few months after that experience, that product management experience, that I joined NDB. And then I couldn't quite call myself a facilitator yet because I hadn't really marketed myself as such to anyone and been hired as such. And so then being in the community and then practicing, learning the craft more, making connections, making networks, and then actually doing a bit of practice, like at the first festival after I met you for the first time here in Amsterdam. That gave me the confidence to say, okay, I want to be a facilitator. And then through a connection at NDB, I actually got my first just like pure workshop facilitation gig. And it was still online, but there was no technical aspect of it. There was no literal team management aspect of it. It was just me coming in, having a strategy session with a team, and then leaving. And I remember being done with that. I was like, oh my God, I did it. I facilitated a workshop. I'm a facilitator now. So I think that was it. It was the first opportunity that I had to, outside of any other context, say, okay, I'm going to come in. I'm going to help a team work through a process, and then I'm going to go. And I was like, okay, now I am this.
Yeah. And when you look at the way you craft a one-off team workshop now, as opposed to back then, was the aspect of experience already there? And maybe I should give the audience a little bit of context, because when I think of Cate, or when I'm in Cate's never done before workshop, then there's always a part of immersive experience. So you're usually dressed in the context or in the same theme of the workshop. And this obviously, for never done before workshops, I don't know whether you dress up for a team workshop. And everything helps the participant to really become part of a different world that you're creating.
I think my first inkling or instance of that, I'll go ahead and call it a talent, and preference, was actually during the course. So the course was with Mischief Makers, and it was, like I said, at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. And it was a several-week course, and at the end, you did, with your team, I think we had a team of 5 course mates, you deliver a pro bono workshop for typically a nonprofit. And I had the fortune of, I love my team, and I'm still in contact with several of them. And I had the fortune of having a designer on the team. And so she brought this lovely, she was a lovely person anyway, but also when we were talking about, okay, how are we going to structure this thing? And really it's like a lightning decision jam with some reflection. And somebody was like, do we need a theme? Or no, it was just a joke. It was like, oh, what if we made it a theme about like, I don't know, injecting fun into your process? And then we made all these medical jokes. And I was like, we should have a theme. And they were like, yeah. And then like, and now I understand within certain constraints, then your creativity really flows. Mm-hmm. And for me, themes do that. And so we didn't go with the medical theme because we were like, oh, wait, it's COVID. That's bad timing. I'm glad somebody thought of that, because like I was already in the rabbit hole and I was like, oh, Tom, you're right. Yeah, no, that's insensitive. So we went with space instead. And we designed together, especially our designer on the team, like the most fabulous Miro board. It was so great. And then I saw, and for me, it was just fun, but I saw the way that our client reacted to it. And they had been doing online workshops for, years at this point, but they had never seen anything like this. And so we designed this whole space world. And then we, loosely dressed up, quote unquote, like astronauts. And, we had, our warm up was like space alien themed and, the whole thing. And we named all of our different exercises spacey things. But just to see their reaction when they saw how much effort that we put into creating this board, and also just like how quickly you can attach to that metaphor. And even online with a Miro board, they were transported. Mm. And that's the first time when I was like, aha, like my instinct was right. Themes are important. And this element of, you don't need to physically move people necessarily to transport them to a place where they are able to let go of the everyday and have a fresh perspective on things. So yeah, that was definitely the first time in like this business setting. I think also probably my greatest achievement in terms of experience design was my wedding in 2009. And I get so much joy out of...
Could you tell us about the wedding?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the wedding took place in San Francisco, where my now ex There are no hard feelings. And I had been living for several years. And so we invited our families, which are both from the Midwest of the US, and friends from the East Coast where I had them. We invited everyone to San Francisco. And so it was a destination in a sense for many people. And we picked an old, like, Freemason hall. So it was an old building. I think the building, it was a multi-story building that was an event space. And we picked the attic, not the attic, but it was a place that used to be a theater. Mm-hmm. And so it was all red velvet, and there was a stage, and it was this kind of neo-Gothic, really like rich, dark wood paneling with these incredible chandeliers. Mm. And you had to ride up to it in a manually operated elevator. Beautiful. I know, it was so cool. And so we walked into the space, and it was like both of us instantly, we were like, this is the place. Like, this place, like, you don't need to decorate it at all. Like, this is an incredible space. And so what I did then, what I like to do now, is just receive the gifts that a place has for us. And so we're not religious. And for us at the time, it wasn't important to have necessarily like particularly traditional things about our wedding. Although it was like the format was pretty traditional. But so rather than, and I had very strong feelings about not being walked down the aisle or given away. And so what we ended up doing was we were on the stage. So we had hors d'oeuvres and everybody was like out in front. Of course, the drinks were great because that's part of what I'm about. And then people walked into the big hall where the theater was, and the curtain was down. So the red curtain was down. People walked up and took their seats on either side of the aisle. There was an organist. It's one of the oldest organs in the US. And we hired this guy whose only job was to go around town and play organs. And so, like, we had seen him at a sing-along for The Sound of Music at the Castro Theater once. And he was just like, and so there was like this organ music playing. And so that at that moment we were on stage behind the curtain, but there was a little flap where you could like peek and watch people, and just like watching our guests come in and look around and wonder at this space and get transported. Was beautiful. And also I almost got sick because it made me so nervous. I had such performance anxiety. But so then at a certain point, the organ music stopped and they shut the doors in the back, and everybody turned around waiting for me to walk up the aisle. And that's when we lifted the curtain, and nobody expected to find us standing on the stage together. And so we were backlit by candles, and like for a couple seconds, people were really confused, like, what's going on? Where is Cate? What's happening? But then the curtain lifted and there we were. And it wasn't until some people turned around and started like laughing and clapping. Mm. And then at that moment, like everybody just stood up and gave us a standing ovation because it was the element of surprise, right? Yeah. Everybody was there for a purpose. Yeah. And they're united in this, of course, in this feeling of love for us and excitement for us. But then I was like, and actually, I was surprised too. I was overwhelmed. I was like a deer in the headlights. And my friend Alyssa just like put her, hands to her mouth and was like, Kate! And that snapped me out of it. And I was like, oh, hi, hello. So yeah, so that was like, people still talk about that, that moment.
I believe that. And I can see your signature of what you're doing nowadays in workshops and that you offer to your clients is this element of surprise, despite the clear purpose and everyone being aligned on the process of what might happen, but then still bringing in something.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Part of my practice is trying to bring self-awareness to what I have been doing just on instinct for a while. And so after Thomas Landthaler and I did the first installation of the dungeon, which was in itself very much sort of immersive.
Yeah. Also at the NDB festival.
Yes.
Last year.
Yes. Yeah. It became a question for us and for me. It's like, okay, that was such a special experience. And we both agreed, and he wrote about this recently, to not rerun that specific version, because for us also, this is not on the level of getting married, but like, I believe that when we create what I now refer to as a peak experience, we are also in it.
Yeah.
Right. And so we decided not to run that again because for us, it had been a very peak experience. And we got the feedback that it was a very moving experience for our participants. And to honor that was important. But also, and so we decided not to rerun it because that would sort of cheapen it a bit. But also that lit this thought in me. I was like, can we not? Okay, not redo that. You can't redo specifically a thing because it was a specific time, specific people in the room, specific context of the festival. But I was like, no, but I bet there are building blocks to that experience. Yeah. And so this year I started researching ideas of what sort of taboo are really about and what fantasy are really about, and also what peak experience is really about. And so I've tried to bring a bit of intention to design in this way. So we did run a dungeon again this summer. It was not the same, but those are the principles that I applied to it and that now I try to apply to all of my work, because there are a few elements, and the element of surprise is definitely one that make it memorable, right? And it's that surprise that does shake people up. And in that moment of them being a little bit detached from all of their preconceived notions, that's when the opportunity is to really help people step into whatever purpose it is that brought us together, or to help open them to greater connection, or even just different perspectives.
Yeah. And I love that through the element of surprise, and then it depends how you surprise them. But from what I hear is people step into the space, they are confronted with something that they haven't expected because it's unusual, and they somehow sense the care in the preparation. And then you don't have to ask them to take deep breaths and to ground themselves, because they're in the experience and in the space right away.
Yeah, I think there's an element of people recognizing when you take a risk. So going back to the example that I gave earlier about being recognized for being brave, and what is implicit in that is like, you took a risk, and I respect that. And that also, I think, is part of what I try to bring. And it's modeling. It is modeling to a certain extent, being vulnerable and being willing to say, okay, I'm going to put a lot of thought into this, and I am going to be in this space with you. Yeah. And that also builds this level of, like, it's a first step toward openness.
And it is a risk as such, because and I'm one of them saying that you cannot participate and facilitate at the same time. And if I understand you correctly, you're not participating in the sense that you're part of the idea generation or the conversation, but you do participate in the immersive experience. So you're in the experience with them.
Yeah.
That makes yourself very vulnerable.
Indeed. It does. It can. And it also is I think I would say that I am kind of a physical embodiment of a process. In a sense, like not the embodiment, but I do I hesitate to say that I'm a participant, like you said, because it's not as though I'm contributing to the conversations per se,
or the content.
Yeah. But I will do, like we experienced recently, like if there is a movement component, I may be in the movement with you, right? Because so that I can help carry the energy that hopefully this exercise will result in. So yeah, and also by showing up if it's something fun like at NDB in a costume. Actually, I did do some costume stuff at a recent professional training too. That is also like, if it comes from I try to bring it of a place where people already know that I'm serious about what I'm doing, and I'm clear about why I'm doing this kind of off the cuff thing, and that it is in the hopes that people see me doing something a little bit off the cuff means that they will also be free to do it themselves.
And I think that's where the authenticity comes in. So if you do this and show up in a costume in a professional, serious meeting or process, that totally makes sense for me, knowing you, because it's so you. If I would suddenly dress up because thinking that, oh, this is the new way of doing it, and I have to add some surprise, might be very odd. And then rather lead to this feeling of awkward, maybe it's about feeling comfortable in your own skin. So if you do this from a space of comfort, you help the others to also be very comfortable wherever they are.
Yeah. I would shy away from the word comfort because it's not it's seldom comfortable, quote unquote, for me, right? But it is, I would say, coming from a place of very honest intent, and it's not a performance. So it's not, even if I show up in, we keep talking about costume. I've only done that a few times, but like in embodying a role per se, like in the dungeon, I take on a very different kind of persona that I would in like a typical workshop. It's much more dominant, I would say.
Yeah.
That is coming from a place of what I think this space needs right now. And it's not about me performing for validation. And so that I try to be very, very clear on in the way that I conduct myself in these settings. So I think sometimes on the flip side of what we're talking about is when you're talking about like, okay, is a facilitator a participant? Are they out of touch? Like people are like, oh, I don't do games. You know, this typical protest that you get when you talk about doing workshop facilitation, like, oh, I don't do games, or that's silly. That has no place here at work. I think sometimes that comes from like you were just saying, like maybe there's a disconnect, or you're performing a function as a facilitator and people aren't picking up on what the connection is between the two. So yeah, I try very hard, very, very hard to have established myself first before I go into this.
And you mentioned the concept of persona, and I like that. So you incorporate a persona, and it's as if there's suddenly, oh gosh, this sounds schizophrenic, but there are suddenly two facilitators, right? So there's a facilitator, you in charge of the process, and the persona is a co-facilitator supporting the atmosphere somehow. How do you decide on the persona? Is it like the equivalent of a decoration or the music, or how does it come to you?
I mean, it comes down to purpose and what kind of, so it's what is the desired outcome of whatever environment we're in. And we do this anyway when we're designing our workshops, right? So like you said, it's decoration, or also maybe it's, you know, you might think about the physical space and how you want the physical space set up. And why do we do that? It's because we want the physical space to foster the dynamics that will get us to whatever outcome we're looking for. And I just extend that to my personality. And if I choose to play a persona, then that is what drives it. So yeah, which is different than I think than managing energy in a room. That is something that I'm still practicing and I'm learning how to do. And I think the tone that I take, or the persona, or if I do adopt any kind of like mild-mannered costume, that is, I think, maybe your analogy is, I think your analogy is good. It is just another layer. And then so I become part of the physical experience. Yeah.
Or emotional.
Yeah.
Because the next thing that just come to my mind is that when someone listens to that, a costume, a persona, a decoration, it sounds very playful, and it is. And still something that I believe distinguishes your work is that you go very deep, very quickly. And deep in the sense of going to talk about things that are uncomfortable, touching on taboos, as you just said. And I wonder then whether this persona or the setting also creates a space where it's allowed to do that, similar to the dungeon. So you create a little bit of a distance to what we would call reality. And therefore giving permission to the participants to go maybe a little bit deeper, or to act, to show a side of themselves that they usually don't show.
Yeah. Yes. And you actually, thank you. I was trying to get at that earlier, but you just said it much more succinctly and directly than I did. There is giving permission through taking the risk of putting so much of myself out there. Because anytime because as you said at the very beginning, people sense the attention that was put into it, and they sense that there is intention to it. And that lets people know, I think, that I am serious and I am creating this space and I am willing to step out of my own normalcy, quote unquote normalcy, whatever that means, in service of this. And I do think people respond to that. Yeah. And also it is this idea of the threshold, right? It is a bit of a psychological threshold. So even if there isn't a perfect space, right? Even if you're online, and especially if you're online, I think it is a powerful tool because it's hard enough to create a container online. And so then if the person who is responsible for creating the container becomes part of the container, I think that resonates a lot.
Beautiful.
And to clarify, it's not always, because I know 99.9% of the people who might hear this have not been in one of my workshops.
Not yet.
It's not yet. It isn't just a costume, right? So, for instance, in the dungeon, the first one, it was about taboos, and it was about taboos in our field. And so I took it immediately as soon as Thomas and I had that conversation. My brain went to the world of kink, because in the world of kink, you are operating outside norms, right? There would be no need to have kink and express yourself, and there would be no concept of it if we didn't have norms. And the norms, of course, in so many aspects of what we do are just on autopilot, and are they serving us or not? So a lot about what I try to do is getting people to question whatever the norms are in whatever context. And so this particular context was the context of facilitation, and what are the things that we're just accepting without really questioning. And then the questioning becomes the taboo. And so the metaphor that I chose to embody in that case was actually wearing a bondage, like rope, right? And I was fully clothed, just so everyone knows. But I was wearing a bind that kept my hands bound. And so in that sense, I was putting myself physically into a situation where, you know, if people notice that I was actually in this bind, that in and of itself is a taboo, right? That is bringing taboos from the outside world into this. And then also a physical risk in the sense that if something went wrong during the workshop and my co-facilitator, you know, or something happened, like I was extremely vulnerable in that case. So yeah. And also then it was a metaphor for how we are bound by our assumptions and by the norms when we don't question them. So I think, yeah, that was one of my favorite examples of when and the persona that I took, and both of us took in that case, was a very sort of like dominant and strong tone setting, facilitation tone.
Yeah. And I was in the workshop, and what I found fascinating was how then the participant, who didn't expect that, obviously, so that was a surprise, suddenly dimmed the light in their surrounding, chose to have a
Zoom background,
virtual background. So suddenly everyone spoke with a slightly lower voice. And I still remember all the conversations I had in this workshop.
Oh, beautiful.
Because they were extremely vulnerable. And I think the space you created also, helped the conversations to be so vulnerable. And that was very liberating to speak about the taboos in the world of facilitation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And fun.
Yes.
I think everyone had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Yeah, you definitely made yourself a name in this workshop. Do you think that you can make an experience out of every single workshop? So, for instance, if a leadership team hires you for their annual meeting where they have to take all these strategic decisions, would you make this an experience as well?
Always. Yeah. You mentioned that was a beautiful moment when in the dungeon, completely unprompted, there was this, I think, is it synchrony among participants that created an in group. And when I saw that happening as a facilitator, I was like, oh, in the 1 year I've been facilitating, this is the best thing ever. And I want to highlight that because I think this is another aspect that it's the serendipity. And in that case, and this, again, going with the unexpected, but then the unexpected gelling of a community within a workshop, that by a workshop's very nature, if you really put people in a space where they are in connection with one another, then every time it will be an experience. So yes, I mean, by the very nature of the content and workshops being created by the participants, everyone has the opportunity to be surprising, to have serendipity in it, and to not be repeatable, right? And so,
I love that.
Yeah.
Be repeatable. Yeah.
And so I don't chase repeating, but I do believe, to get to your question, that you can create conditions. And so it may not always happen, but I do create conditions where it could. And so that is taking, again, I always start with the purpose of, and so in this case, a retreat or a team coming on site all together for the first time. And even within an existing format, like last year, I did a 40-person retreat for actually a startup that I had been a Scrum Master for. And then they called me back to do this workshop, which was a nice compliment. And they just wanted everyone together. So, and they wanted people to have a chance to physically be together and interact. So, yes, even in a team retreat, there is an opportunity to create a memorable peak experience. I mean, they're all experiences, but are we creating something that will actually be memorable and stick with people?
Because it's not repeatable, because it touches our emotion and hence we'll remember it more.
Yes. Yes. So yes, I mean, because what I've experienced and from everything that I have studied, there are a few different components to this, right? And so we talked about the surprise and related to that, the serendipity. Also, idyllic locations. And so idyllic is relative, right? I think that this is where our imagination and the tone that we set can create this location, right? And so that's why I love the challenge of spaces, generally speaking. So I did a team retreat this summer in London. It was a team of IT leaders who are a very kind group of people, and they were coming together. They typically work remotely, and they manage, different teams in different European countries. And so they were going to be in London together for 2 days. And it was the first time since the pandemic they had all been together, and they did 2 days together. So I had 4 hours on the second day, let's say. So we had started, this is a great example of learning how to negotiate and sticking with something. So at first it was like, oh, okay, 2 whole days. Great. And then we thought we had a budget. I was working through an agency, and we thought we had a budget. And then suddenly, and I spent some serious thought on this and being like, oh my God, thinking like, I'm going to be in London. I'm going to have 2 whole days. I've got a budget. Like, I am going to blow this up. It is going to be amazing. And then they were like, actually, no, we have like 10% of what we thought, or like 25%, let's say, of the original budget. And can you do something in like 4 hours?
Oh.
But I had already made plans in London. And so I was like, yeah, yeah, I'll do this. And because also it's still an opportunity. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, I can do this. I can create something memorable, something they've not seen before in these, and I can do it in these 4 hours. And so I ended up getting to the hotel space where we were, and the room, there were 15 of us, 16 including me. Of course, there was just a big table in the middle. And so immediately I was like, please, please move this. Actually, we needed a table because one of the experiences was Lego, and I needed people to be able to spread out with it. But then there was this beautiful, these beautiful bookcases full of the most interesting and totally useless objects. But immediately I was like, this room is a gift. This room is too small for our purposes, but it is a gift because I'm going in 2 hours. I know exactly what I'm going to have people do and interact in this room. with this room and the objects in this room where we couldn't have done it anywhere else. And so that's part of what the challenge that I love too. So, and this is part of creating this idyllic space. It's like you make the idyllic space. And it's not just how the tables are arranged. I mean, this is a big thing, but you can always work with whatever you've got. So in that instance, that became part of the memory making. And in this particular, the example is, okay, take in the greater service of being the greater purpose of being more aware and open to the possibilities around us, grab an object from the shelf and talk about it for 2 minutes. And you know, when you do that, maybe you've done this with a pen before or a cup, and you know, people, they run out of typical things to say in about 30 seconds. And then they really have to dig into observing and feeling and experiencing that object just to fill the 2 minutes. And so this room became the perfect vehicle for that because there were so many random things.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And then I did make use of London to a certain extent because we went through, actually, it was a flow from the emotional culture deck about deciding what emotions you think are critical to your team's success. And then moving in through a flow of coming to consensus as a team. So you do that as an individual, and then you work in pairs and small groups. And then as a team, you say, okay, these are our top 5. And then the other part of the experience was, okay, now I gave everybody 2 emotions, to every team 2 emotions, and I sent them out into the city for 40 minutes to take photos of what they thought represented those emotions. And then we had a slideshow at the end. So this is for me how we can create peak experiences out of any opportunity, right? So understanding what you would think the constraints are.
Yeah.
And then deciding that they're not.
Yeah. And I love the experience of finding objects and taking pictures of things that represent the emotions, because for the team that goes on the emotion hunt,
yeah,
they need to have this conversation. What does it actually mean? Very vulnerable, very deep. But since they're on a mission, it kind of makes it lighter and for a higher purpose.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by the fact of taking them outside and walking, it's easier to talk about these things. And then coming back together, it's sharing this experience. And having the pictures means taking them back home and really having a representation of what you're talking about when you speak about the emotions.
Yeah. And I hope this idea that you can take inspiration from anywhere. And by having a bit of transference, you're still talking about emotions, but because you're talking about it via an object or a photo that you took, it flows much more easily and it dials down the vulnerability enough that you can do it with people you might normally not.
Yeah. What makes a workshop fail?
Well, I started with an example of failure. So in my experience, I think I have a hard time with the concept of failure, generally speaking. Things go wrong, right? But I also think that even in the case of this total spectacular failure, it lived on in success and people still took something away. So even if that had been terrible, if that had been a failure and I would have called it off and I would have left the team, I would hope and didn't come back. So, if I had just been in one-off facilitator, I would hope that the people who saw that as brave would have taken that away. So yeah, I have a hard time thinking of any workshop as a complete failure.
And yes, I see that, because the example you gave is something you turned into an opportunity, into a learning opportunity and growth opportunity for you and for the team. And I'm just thinking that if you'd stayed there, not being the brave person, but kind of pushing through and trying to get the teams to do the work, or just go back to the mirror board and fill it in. This can eventually lead to a failure.
Potentially, yeah, you're right. I see what you mean.
Where then everyone has the impression that they wasted their time.
Yeah.
And disconnected from the purpose and from the team members.
Yeah. And which was where I was going to start, actually, because in that way, in that situation, I put myself and the team in that position because I had my own goal. I took that opportunity because I wanted to go through this process and I wanted to take the opportunity to facilitate something with this team. But I was disconnected from really what the team needed. And so in this way, and also going back to what we were talking about when, what it means to have a persona in the service of the group. And that's what I was getting at about not being performative with it.
Yeah.
If it becomes about my needs, that I think is the seed of failure. Yeah. Not that it will necessarily fail, but I think that is a seed of failure.
Okay, so then it's not what makes a workshop fail, but what are the conditions that could lead to failure?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there's one more thing that I'm curious about. Circling back to the experiences and then also continuing the conversation of the on-site, because it's interesting after your explanation of the dungeon and the mirror board and the costumes. I was totally in the online world and then struggled to imagine, okay, so, but what does it mean in the on-site world? And your London example really made that clear for me. And then I know that you also do these experiences where you actually don't create experiences just through the space, but have teams going to actual experiences. So the craft workshop, for instance. I would love to hear more about that and how you weave the craft into something that could then be a strategy or a team workshop.
I love the metaphor of weaving because actually that is one of the experiences.
Yay!
Yay! So I myself went through, this is a personal aspect of it. So several years ago, after my husband and I split, I was just in a very, very deep reflective time and I found the craft of throwing pottery on the wheel. And it was such an incredibly healing experience for me to be absorbed. It's hard. It is challenging, this craft, and to be completely absorbed in it and then to create something with my hands after years and years of doing digital work really did shift something in me. And it was a quasi sort of meditative experience. And so the listeners, you can't hear me, but I'm actually moving in the motion of what it feels like to move the clay on the wheel, because now it's just become a part of my physical memory. So I've been doing pottery for about 6 years now and have found a lovely community of people around it and believe in the power of one, physical engagement in whatever form that takes to open our minds and our hearts. And so I got this idea a few months ago that I think that there is a lot to do with actually, in drawing parallels back to the world of software development, this idea of experimentation, failing, learning, repeating. And it is very challenging for all of us to get into. And so what I like to do is, in the case of pottery, for instance, bring people to the studio, bring a team to the studio, and just sit them down at the wheel and not show them what to do, but just let them to start to play.
Play with clay.
Yes. And it's, like I said, it's not easy. And right off the bat, this is sort of a threshold moment when people realize, oh, what is happening? I am not in control of this. And so you learn so much immediately about yourself. And if you do look up and watch others, about people, how people respond to this.
Yeah.
And it's super interesting because there are always people who want, and I instruct through, right? I give light direction because, of course, you don't just know what to do at the pottery mill, but I don't demonstrate. So there is no sort of preconceived notion from me about what you should produce. Maybe you have an idea in your head, but very quickly when you understand the reality of the wheel, you're not going to get there. You're not going to throw that vase today. You're not going to make that mug today. And so when people realize, oh, okay, this expectation that I had, I have to completely let go of. This is another very powerful experience. And so there are always people who are listening to what I'm saying and getting absorbed into the clay, but then also being like, okay, now what? And then there's always the person who is just completely off the rails, right? It's the person on your team who's just like, I like to do it myself, or I'm just going to go do it. Okay. And you're like, but the process. And they're like, no. And so that person is just off exploring on their own. And in this context, it's fine too. Right. But to be able to call attention and awareness to how you respond in these situations, and then how as a team you come back together, is great. And it's especially great if you can see, okay, a leader getting frustrated or a leader failing at something, right? And how do they react to it? And how do you feel as a team member watching this?
Yeah.
And so it's really good. It's so good. The weaving experience is a bit different. I'm not going to give it away because there is a big surprise element to it. You have to sign up to find out. But also, there it's more about team dynamics, like achieving something together per se. The pottery is more about together, but a separate experience. And so then typically maybe I'll pause and say like, okay, how are you feeling right now? It just depends on the group. But then we always harvest at the end. Okay, so what came up for you? What was this like for you? How did you feel at certain times? Were there, if you were to draw, your roller coaster retrospective, like, were there high points? Were there low points? What was it like to see your teammates do this? And so then you can draw those parallels to say like, okay, and now we've washed our hands and we've left this space. And now we're going back to our typical context. And so then these themes that we've harvested, which are some typical themes come up, and then some things very specific about a team's context always comes up. So then we can say, okay, like make a metaphor out of it. Okay, what is the clay in your day? Or what is the wheel in your day? Where do you feel out of control in your day or in this process that your team is in?
Yeah.
How are you reacting to it? How do you witness others react to it? And so then it is, again, it's transference. You're going through a collective experience together, which is intense and also creative and lends you new perspectives on whatever it is you've got going on. And it's beautiful because it could be a tactical issue. It could be that the team is, for whatever reason, not gelling, or maybe they've gone through big changes recently. There are all sorts of ways all sorts of things that we loosen up through these immersive experiences, which then open the floor to discussing them.
Yeah. Thank you. I have all these ideas now popping up, and one of them where I can see it so clearly, teams spend time filling in these surveys and doing the DISC analysis to find out about what kind of personality are the different team members and what does it mean for collaborating. And then this is a very different approach to have this conversation and make it actually stick and tangible to what it means then in reality or in everyday interactions.
Yeah. Yes. And thematically speaking, I think it can be related to some things that, for instance, we do with Lego Serious Play. And so this is, for me, a very, I think, expanded version on that. And I think this is a beautiful thing about when you ask, can you make anything an experience? Like, yes, you can make an experience out of 7 minutes, like we did this weekend at our boot camp, right? So when you break it down into its core elements, you can make something memorable that will stick with people in very little time.
Love it. Do you create experiences in your private life?
Yeah. In a few different ways. I also try to create them for myself, right?
I love that.
I go back home to where my family is in Indiana a couple times a year. And if I allowed the part of me that is like, oh, Indiana, I left and, it's boring there, blah, blah, blah. If I allowed that mindset to dominate my visits there, they would be so unsatisfying. But instead, I take this mind. It's like, okay, I'm going to find a weird random thing to do. And there's always something everywhere, right? And there are always, and then I involve my family members who may not have even known that this weird thing was there in their backyard. And so then we create these experiences together, right? Making memories.
Beautiful.
Oh.
What remains your facilitation challenge?
Oh, there's so many. So I think for me, a focus for the next year is actually going to be on very specifically energy management, because I do of myself and also within the room, because there have been instances in the past where, because I do tend to take people to vulnerable spaces, the energy naturally can get very heavy. And so I'm trying to get better at supporting in that space and then also moving that energy, using a bit of alchemy to change this vulnerable energy and what can be a little low energy into momentum again. Mm-hmm. So I think it's fine, but I know that I can make it shine. And that's going to be my focus.
Beautiful. I am curious. Great. It's coming out.
Yeah.
We've spoken for over an hour. Is there anything that you would have liked to talk about, but we haven't touched upon yet?
I think something that is core to my work in facilitation and then in volunteer work that I do is the concept of mutual support. And I come at almost every workshop with this value in mind. And the experience is the container that will open people to it. But it is this idea of encouraging people to ask for support and then be open to receiving support that I think actually is what lasts and what has the possibility, gives us the possibility and the opportunity to actually change the way we are in the world and therefore change the world. And so yes, this is to me, it's also at the core of why you and I know each other, because you created this beautiful community, which is at its core about supporting each other's growth. So it would be to come on this podcast without acknowledging that and to acknowledge the fact that I operate, and I know all of us operate with our values and from a place of our values. I don't think it would be a service to our relationship or my practice to skip that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for this inspiring conversation for me, very insightful to look behind the curtains of your work that I have experienced over the last 2 years. And that's inspiring, hopefully, future work to look at it a little bit from a different perspective.
I am also curious. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for staying tuned and for listening until the very end. I hope that you found the inspiration and the wisdom that you are looking for. And I hope that you will subscribe to the show so that you never miss any of the interviews with another inspiring facilitator from across the world. I'm devoted to continue this podcast and to deliver weekly an episode that maintains the quality that you expect and you deserve. And if you would like to help me to maintain this quality and to keep the podcast free, please help us. Visit workshops.work/support to make a small donation to keep the podcast free. Thank you so much. I hope to be in your ears next week.